Picture this. The year is 67 AD. The sun is sinking low over the marble sprawl of Rome, casting long shadows through the columns of the Forum. The air smells of roasting chestnuts from street vendors and the sharp tang of incense wafting from nearby temples. Citizens bustle in togas and tunics, their sandals clicking against worn stone pavements polished by centuries of footsteps. Statues of gods and emperors loom above, their eyes fixed in eternal watchfulness. And then, through this scene of everyday imperial life, comes a procession that makes even the most jaded Roman stop and stare. Guards in polished armor flank a tall, broad-shouldered man whose face everyone knows, the emperor himself, Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. At his side walks a vision draped in silk and gold, a figure so luminous that whispers follow like a shadow. Those whispers are not admiration. They are disbelief. They are scandal. Because beneath the cascade of jewels and the fine braided hair, there is a truth that no one dares to speak aloud. The woman, beside the most powerful man in the world, was once a boy named Sporus. And what Nero had done to him was not simply cruel. It was a calculated dismantling of a human being, both body and soul. The story you're about to hear is not another lurid tale of Roman decadence for its own sake. It is about how absolute power warped love into possession, grief into madness, and a living human into a reflection of a fantasy that should never have been pursued. But before we reach the moment when Sporus' life becomes a stage for the emperor's obsession, we need to step backward to understand the man at the center of it all. Nero was not born the monster history often paints. When he ascended to the throne at just 16, Rome dared to hope. The young ruler lowered taxes, funded public entertainment, and, to the delight of the masses, performed music and theater himself. In those early years, the empire glittered with the promise of a golden age. Yet, Rome was also a city that thrived on spectacle and feared weakness. And absolute power, as it always does, began to carve fissures into Nero's mind. By the year 65 AD, paranoia had settled in like a sickness. Imagine living as the single untouchable figure in an empire of 60 million. Never contradicted, never told no. Every conversation around you laced with flattery, every smile calculated. Was it that constant isolation that warped him? Or was it the loss of the one person he claimed to love more than life itself that pushed him beyond reason? Her name was Poppaea Sabina. To Nero, she was beauty in human form. A woman whose intelligence matched her ambition, whose charm could turn enemies into allies, and whose presence made the emperor believe in his own legend. But Rome's streets would one day speak her name with both reverence and dread. And as we move deeper into this story, you will see how her influence and her fate set into motion one of the most disturbing transformations in ancient history. Poppaea Sabina did not simply appear in Nero's life. She entered like a force of nature, reshaping the landscape of the imperial court around her. She was born into privilege, the daughter of Titus Olius, a man of equestrian rank, and Poppaea Sabina the Elder, celebrated for her beauty. From childhood, Poppaea inherited more than striking features. She learned the subtle arts of Roman high society, how to charm without appearing calculating, how to draw confidences from powerful men, and, most dangerously, how to turn admiration into influence. In a city where women of her rank were often confined to the shadows of political life, Poppaea was determined to be a player in the game, not a pawn. When Nero first encountered her, he was still married to Octavia, a union that had been arranged for politics, not passion. Octavia was dutiful, restrained, and utterly unlike Poppaea. To the emperor, she was marble, cold, flawless, and lifeless. Poppaea, by contrast, was fire. Historical accounts disagree on whether Poppaea truly loved Nero or simply saw in him the ultimate prize, the most powerful man in the known world. But what's certain is that she knew exactly how to hold his attention. Their meetings were whispered affairs at first, hidden within the labyrinth of the palace. She'd wear perfumes imported from Arabia, oils so rare that a single vial could cost more than a senator's estate. The air would shimmer with the scent of frankincense and myrrh as they spoke in lone voices, away from prying eyes. Poppaea had mastered the art of calculated vulnerability. She'd praise Nero's artistry when others mocked it, urging him to perform for her in private. She'd plant seeds of doubt about Octavia's loyalty, never openly accusing, just enough to let suspicion take root. In the Roman world, divorce among the elite was not uncommon, but to discard an empress was to court political disaster. Octavia was the daughter of the beloved Emperor Claudius and the sister of Britannicus. She was, in the eyes of the people, untouchable. But Nero was a man unused to resisting his desires, and Poppaea's allure was relentless. She became a constant presence in the palace, first as a guest, then something far more dangerous, a figure who could make demands and have them met. It wasn't just beauty that captivated Nero. Poppaea spoke of ambition without shame. She shared his taste for luxury, Eastern silks that shifted like water under torchlight, silver tableware engraved with scenes from Homer, pearls that had once adorned Cleopatra herself. She understood the intoxicating blend of love and politics that fueled life at court. Still, beneath the charm lay steel. Poppaea knew she could not truly secure her position while Octavia lived and held the title of empress. And so, through careful suggestion, emotional appeals, and the steady application of jealousy, she began to turn Nero against his wife. Rome would soon learn just how far the emperor was willing to go for her. Nero had always loved spectacle, the grand gesture, the performance that left no doubt about his power or his passions. And when it came to Poppaea Sabina, his displays of devotion became imperial theater on a scale only Rome could imagine. Silks from China, brought overland along the Silk Road and then by ship through Parthian ports, perfumes distilled from rare Arabian blossoms, servants dispatched to Alexandria to secure emeralds the size of grapes. The imperial treasuries bent themselves to one purpose, satisfying Poppaea's every desire. She was no longer simply a favored consort. She was the center of his universe. And as her place in Nero's life grew, Octavia's diminished, until it was little more than a title. Rome, however, did not forget Octavia. She was the daughter of Claudius, the last link to a line of emperors the people still respected. Removing her would not be a simple matter of divorce. It would require a rewriting of the imperial story. Nero began quietly assembling accusations: infidelity, infertility, disloyalty. In the Roman world, even an empress could be undone by rumor, provided it came from the right lips. Poppaea knew this well, and while she never openly condemned Octavia, she was a master at letting suspicion ferment in the emperor's mind. The moment came in 62 AD. Octavia was accused, tried in absentia, and banished to the island of Pandateria, the same wind-scoured exile that had swallowed other imperial women before her. The people rioted in her defense, filling the streets with cries for her return. Statues of Poppaea were torn down, her name spat like a curse. But Nero was unmoved. The army quelled the unrest, and Octavia's exile became permanent, a permanence secured days later when she was executed, her veins opened under the watch of imperial agents. It was an end both swift and silent. With Octavia gone, there was nothing left to bar Nero from making Poppaea his wife. The wedding was an event staged for history. The emperor resplendent in purple robes, Poppaea crowned with pearls heavy with a diadem, the air thick with incense and the sound of musicians playing flutes and lyres. The ceremony was more than a union. It was a statement, a declaration that Nero could reshape the imperial order at will, even if it meant defying tradition, the Senate, and the will of the people. For a time, it seemed as though Poppaea had secured everything she had sought: the title of Augusta, the loyalty of the emperor, and the influence to shape policy itself. She advised Nero on matters of foreign diplomacy, particularly with Parthia and the eastern provinces, where her refinement and intelligence impressed visiting dignitaries. But power in Rome was always fragile, especially for those who did not inherit it by birthright. Poppaea's position, as secure as it appeared, was tied to the whims of a man whose temper could ignite without warning. And as history would prove, that fire would one day turn on her. For a while, Rome saw something almost unheard of in the imperial palace: an empress whose beauty was matched by her political instinct. Poppaea Sabina was no passive ornament. She attended council meetings, offered private counsel on military appointments, and, according to several sources, played a role in smoothing negotiations with the Parthian Empire. She understood that an empress could wield influence without holding official office, and she used it with precision. Nero, at first, seemed to welcome her guidance. The two would spend hours in private conversation, debating matters of state as easily as they discussed the latest chariot races. Poppaea encouraged him to focus on consolidating Rome's power in the east, where trade routes and diplomacy promised both wealth and prestige. But political life in Rome was never without enemies. Senators resented her sway over the emperor, whispering that she was an Eastern temptress, undermining Roman tradition. Ordinary citizens, still mourning Octavia, muttered about omens and divine displeasure. The tension outside the palace was mirrored within it. Nero's personality, restless, theatrical, and increasingly unstable, began to strain against Poppaea's careful pragmatism. Where she counseled caution, he preferred grand, impulsive gestures. Where she urged diplomacy, he dreamed of spectacle. By 64 AD, those differences had begun to show. That summer, the Great Fire of Rome consumed much of the city, and though the historical truth remains debated, rumors spread like smoke. Nero had ordered the fire to clear land for his golden house, a sprawling palace complex of unimaginable luxury. Poppaea reportedly urged him to address the public directly, to rebuild quickly, and avoid the perception that he had abandoned his people. But Nero's instinct was for art, not damage control. He staged public performances, recited poetry, and spent lavishly on rebuilding projects that bore his name more prominently than Rome's gods. For many, this confirmed their worst suspicions. Poppaea, caught between her loyalty to Nero and her understanding of public opinion, began to tread a dangerous line. Her influence was undeniable, but so was the emperor's growing impatience with anyone who challenged him, even in private. And then there was the matter of the imperial heir. By 65 AD, Poppaea was pregnant, a fact that momentarily softened Nero's excesses. The birth of a child, especially a son, would secure her position beyond question. The empire waited for the news with tense anticipation. What happened next would shock even the jaded citizens of Rome and would forever darken Nero's legacy. In the spring of 65 AD, the imperial palace buzzed with a rare sense of expectation. Poppaea Sabina, now heavily pregnant, had retreated from the public eye. She spent her days in shaded gardens, attended by physicians and ladies-in-waiting, her diet carefully managed, her every movement watched for signs that the future heir of Rome was ready to enter the world. For Nero, the prospect of a child, especially a son, promised more than personal joy. It was the chance to secure his dynasty, to silence whispers about his instability, and to bind the empire's loyalty to his bloodline. But whatever tenderness he might have felt toward Poppaea was buried beneath the mercurial temperament that had come to define him. Historical sources describe him in those months as increasingly volatile, prone to sudden mood swings, erratic decisions, and bursts of cruelty that seemed to flare without warning. The incident that ended Poppaea's life has been told and retold by historians, though the truth remains clouded. According to Tacitus, the moment came during an argument. The cause is lost to time, perhaps a disagreement over his time spent at the races, perhaps some criticism she dared to voice in private. What is certain is that Nero's rage ignited with terrifying speed. In a fit of temper, he struck her, not with a fist, but with a savage kick to her abdomen. The blow was fatal, killing both Poppaea and the unborn child she carried. Other accounts, like those of Suetonius and Cassius Dio, suggest her death may have been accidental or even the result of illness, but the image of the emperor murdering his pregnant wife was too potent, too consistent with his reputation for Rome to forget. The palace fell into a strange silence in the days that followed. Public mourning was declared, but the grief was as much performance as it was genuine. Nero himself seemed unmoored, wandering the halls, speaking to her chambers as if she might answer, surrounding himself with the scents and silks she had loved. It was then that his obsession took its most grotesque turn. Unable or unwilling to let go of Poppaea's image, Nero began seeking a way to recreate her presence, and in a decision that would leave even jaded Romans horrified, he found his answer not in a noblewoman or courtesan, but in a boy. His name was Sporus, and Nero would see to it that Sporus would never again be a boy. Sporus was young, perhaps in his mid-teens, when he caught Nero's eye. By all accounts, he was strikingly beautiful. his features delicate enough to draw comparisons to Poppaea Sabina. That resemblance, once noticed by the emperor, became an obsession. Nero had wealth, armies, and absolute power. What he did not have was Poppaea. And so, in the twisted logic of his grief, he decided that he would make her again. The plan was as chilling as it was precise. Sporus was seized, stripped of his freedom, and subjected to a brutal operation, castration, ensuring that his body could never mature into manhood. It was an irreversible act, one that Roman society usually reserved for slaves destined for specialized service. For Nero, it was only the beginning. Sporus was clothed in the finest silks, adorned with Poppaea's jewels, and trained to walk, speak, and even carry himself as she once had. The emperor began referring to him openly as Poppaea, as if the act of naming could erase the truth. Then came the spectacle that would sear itself into the memory of Rome: a wedding. In a ceremony witnessed by members of the imperial court, Nero stood beside Sporus as a groom to a bride. The boy wore the traditional bridal veil, his head crowned with a diadem, his face painted in the style of a Roman matron. Nero placed a ring on his hand, kissed him before the assembly, and led him away to be treated as his wife in every respect. To the public, the display was grotesque, a fusion of personal madness and imperial arrogance. In a city that thrived on scandal, this was something more. A deliberate act of defiance against propriety, grief twisted into possession. But within the palace, Sporus's existence was a delicate balancing act. To displease Nero, even unintentionally, could mean exile or death. And so he played the role the emperor demanded, all while living under the gaze of a man who saw in him not a person, but the shadow of a ghost. In the years that followed, Sporus would accompany Nero on public appearances, paraded through the streets like a living effigy. At games, festivals, and diplomatic receptions, he was introduced as the empress. Those who dared to laugh or whisper risked their lives. The boy who had once been Sporus was gone. In his place stood an invention, the final tragic extension of Nero's inability to accept loss. And yet, Sporus' story did not end with Nero. When the emperor's reign collapsed, the boy-turned bride would find himself caught in another web of power and danger, one that would, in its own way, prove just as lethal. When Nero's world finally collapsed in 68 AD, it happened with the speed of a lightning strike. Rebellions flared across the provinces. The Senate declared him a public enemy. Abandoned by his guards, the emperor fled into hiding, taking with him only a handful of loyal attendants and Sporus. In those final hours, the bride stood beside the man who had stolen his youth and identity. Some accounts claim Nero begged Sporus to join him in suicide, asking him to die as Poppaea so they could be reunited in death. Sporus refused. When the soldiers closed in, Nero took his own life with the help of a freedman, leaving Sporus suddenly free, and yet far from safe. Freedom in Rome's year of the 4 emperors was a dangerous thing. In the months after Nero's death, power passed rapidly between rival claimants. Each new emperor brought his own court, his own enemies, and his own ambitions. And Sporus, with his strange and infamous history, was too valuable and too vulnerable to be ignored. Otho, Nero's short-lived successor, took Sporus into his household, treating him as a prized possession. Otho had once been married to Poppaea before Nero stole her away, and some whispered that his interest in Sporus was a mix of revenge, nostalgia, and political theater. But Otho's reign lasted only 3 months before Vitellius claimed the throne. If Nero had been theatrical, Vitellius was brutal. He had heard of Sporus's past and saw an opportunity for mockery. The emperor announced his intention to use Sporus in a public spectacle, a reenactment of the myth of Proserpine, in which the young goddess was abducted and dragged into the underworld. In Rome, such myths were staged as violent public entertainments, often ending in the real death of the performer. For Sporus, it was a sentence dressed as theater. Rather than face that final humiliation, Sporus made his choice. Before the performance could take place, he took his own life. The boy who had once been remade into an empress died on his own terms, ending a story that had begun in the shadow of one of Rome's most infamous rulers. To the chroniclers of the time, Sporus's fate was a grotesque footnote in the history of Nero. But in truth, it was more than that. His life was a mirror held up to the empire itself, a place where beauty could be weaponized, where power could twist love into possession, and where survival sometimes meant surrendering everything that made you who you were.